The morning rush at Grand Central Station was just like any other Tuesday. Thousands of people hurried through the massive hall, their footsteps echoing off the high ceiling. Coffee cups in hand, phones pressed to ears, everyone seemed to be in their own little bubble of urgency. But tucked away in a corner, sitting on a cold metal bench, was a man who looked completely out of place. Not because he was dressed fancy or anything like that. Actually, it was the opposite. His clothes were simple, an old baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, a faded blue jacket that had seen better days, and jeans with a small hole near the knee. What made him different was how still he sat. While everyone else rushed around like ants, he just watched. His name was David, though nobody in that station knew who he really was. And that was exactly how he wanted it. 3 months ago, David's world had completely fallen apart. His father, the only person who truly understood him, had passed away suddenly. One day they were talking about taking a fishing trip together, and the next day David was standing at a funeral, surrounded by hundreds of people who called themselves friends but felt like strangers. You see, David wasn't just any regular guy. He was incredibly rich. The kind of rich where people write articles about how much money you have. His tech company had made him billions, and his face had been on magazine covers more times than he could count. But right now, sitting in this train station, none of that mattered. For the past 3 months, he had been doing something he'd never done before in his adult life, wandering around with no plan. He'd leave his fancy penthouse apartment early, in the morning, and just walk. Sometimes he'd end up in Central Park watching kids play. Other times he'd sit in small cafes in neighborhoods he'd never visited, listening to conversations he wasn't part of. Today, something had drawn him to Grand Central. Maybe it was the energy of all these people going somewhere, having purpose, when he felt so lost himself. He'd been sitting there for almost an hour, just watching the endless stream of commuters. That's when he noticed it. Right in the middle of all the chaos stood a beautiful black piano. It looked so elegant and peaceful, like a quiet island in the middle of a stormy sea. A small sign next to it read, "Play me, I'm yours." David had heard about these public pianos before. The city had placed them in various locations to bring music to everyday spaces. Most people walked right past it without a second glance. A few kids would bang on a key or two before their parents pulled them away. But the piano mostly sat there, waiting. David felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. His fingers actually tingled as he looked at those black and white keys. It was like seeing an old friend after a very long time. He used to play piano. Not just play, he used to live and breathe music. As a kid, he'd spend hours at the piano in his family's small apartment. His mother would have to practically drag him away for dinner. His father, who worked 2 jobs to pay for piano lessons, would sit and listen with the biggest smile on his face. But that was a lifetime ago, before business school, before the startup company, before the meetings and the deals and the constant pressure to make more money, be more successful, achieve more and more and more. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped playing. First, he told himself he was too busy. Then he told himself he'd get back to it later. Eventually, he just forgot how much he loved it. Now, staring at this piano, all those memories came flooding back. He remembered the way his fingers used to dance across the keys. He remembered the feeling of losing himself completely in a piece of music, where nothing else in the world existed except the melody. David stood up slowly. His legs felt a bit shaky, like he was about to do something scary. Which was funny, because he'd given presentations to thousands of people and made business deals worth millions of dollars. But walking over to this piano felt more terrifying than any of that. A few people glanced at him as he approached the piano bench. Most looked skeptical. After all, he didn't look like a pianist. His clothes were ordinary, his hair was messy, from the baseball cap, and he had the tired look of someone who'd been carrying heavy thoughts for too long. David sat down on the bench and immediately felt how different it was from the expensive piano bench in his apartment, the one he hadn't touched in over 10 years. This bench was simple, worn smooth by countless other people who had sat here before him. He lifted the lid and looked down at the keys. They were perfectly clean and well-maintained. Someone clearly took good care of this instrument. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment and he felt his heart beating faster. What if he'd forgotten how to play? What if his fingers were too stiff? What if he made a fool of himself in front of all these strangers? But then he remembered something his father used to tell him. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. David placed his right hand gently on the keys and pressed down on middle C. The note rang out clear and pure, cutting through the noise of the station. A few more people turned to look, but David barely noticed. He was already somewhere else, somewhere he hadn't been in a very long time. He played a simple scale just to test his muscle memory. His fingers were definitely rusty, but they still remembered the basic movements. It was like riding a bicycle. Once you learn, your body never completely forgets. A small group of people had started to gather, maybe 5 or 6 curious onlookers. David could feel their eyes on him, but for the first time in months he didn't care what anyone thought. He wasn't performing for investors or trying to impress anyone. He was just reconnecting with a part of himself he'd thought was gone forever. He decided to try something a little more challenging. His fingers found the opening notes of a piece he used to love, something gentle and familiar. The melody flowed out across the busy terminal, and David felt something inside his chest start to loosen. It was like he'd been holding his breath for years and was finally able to exhale. As he played, David realized something amazing was happening. For the first time since his father's death, he wasn't thinking about business or money or success or failure. He wasn't thinking about the past or worrying about the future. He was just here in this moment with the music. And even though he was surrounded by strangers in one of the busiest places in the city, he didn't feel alone anymore. The first few notes David played weren't perfect. His fingers stumbled a bit, like someone trying to remember how to ride a bike after years of walking everywhere. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced over, shook his head with a slight smile, and kept walking. A teenager with headphones around her neck paused for maybe 3 seconds before deciding this wasn't worth her time. David could feel the judgment, but something inside him refused to give up. He'd spent too many years caring about what other people thought, and look where that had gotten him. Sitting alone in train stations, feeling empty despite having everything money could buy. He tried again, this time choosing a simple piece he used to play as a kid. His mother had loved this particular melody, something soft and gentle that she said reminded her of rain on windows. The notes came easier this time, though his timing was still off in places. That's when he noticed her. A woman in scrubs was walking past on her way to catch a train. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from caring for other people all day and night. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she carried a coffee cup that was probably her 4th or 5th of the day. She was a nurse. Anyone could tell just by looking at her. The melody made her stop mid-step. She stood there for a moment listening, and David saw something change in her expression. The hard lines around her eyes softened a little. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly torn between catching her train and staying to listen. The music won. She moved closer. Not close enough to disturb him, but close enough to really hear. David pretended not to notice, but inside he felt a small spark of something he hadn't felt in months. Connection. Not the fake kind he was used to from business meetings, but something real. Soon, an older man joined her. He walked with a cane, and moved slowly like someone who had all the time in the world because he had nowhere urgent to be. His clothes were neat but worn, and he had the look of someone who'd been coming to this same place every day for a very long time. He stood perfectly still, listening with the kind of attention that young people rarely give to anything anymore. David's fingers were starting to remember now. The muscle memory was kicking in, and the notes flowed more smoothly. He moved into a slightly more challenging piece, like something he'd learned in high school but hadn't touched in decades. It was like meeting an old friend and discovering you still had things to talk about. A mother with a little girl came next. The woman looked stressed, checking her phone constantly and juggling a purse, a backpack, and what looked like grocery bags. But her daughter was mesmerized. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, with pigtails that bounced when she moved her head to the rhythm of the music. "Mommy, why is that man making the piano sing?" the little girl asked in that loud whisper that kids think is quiet. The mother looked up from her phone for the first time since David had started playing. "He's playing music, sweetheart," she said, but her voice was distracted. "Can we listen, please?" The mother checked her phone again, probably calculating whether they had time before their train. David could see the internal struggle on her face, the practical part that said they needed to keep moving, and the part that wanted to give her, daughter, this small moment of wonder. The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Please, Mommy. The music is pretty." Something in the child's voice must have reached her mother's heart, because she finally put her phone away and really looked at what was happening. David was playing with more confidence now, his fingers finding melodies he'd thought were lost forever. The small crowd had grown to maybe 10 people, all standing in comfortable silence, letting the music wash over them. The mother's expression changed completely. The stress lines around her eyes relaxed, and for a moment, she didn't look like someone juggling a million responsibilities. She looked like someone remembering what it felt like to pause and appreciate something beautiful. "Okay, baby," she whispered to her daughter. "We can listen for a little while." David heard this exchange and felt his heart swell. He started playing something more playful, something that seemed to bounce and dance. The little girl began swaying, gently, and even her mother found herself moving slightly to the rhythm. A few more people had joined the group. A delivery worker who'd been rushing through the station slowed down, then stopped completely. 2 college students with heavy backpacks set their bags down and listened. Even a security guard who'd been walking his regular patrol route paused. At the edge of the growing circle, David was getting bolder now. His fingers remembered more than he'd expected them to. He transitioned into a piece that had always been one of his favorites. Something with a melody that seemed to tell a story, all by itself. It started quietly, almost like a secret being shared, then grew stronger and more confident. The nurse in scrubs closed her eyes and let the music surround her. David could see the tension leaving her shoulders. For just these few minutes, she wasn't thinking about patients or medications or the endless demands of her job. She was just here, in this moment, letting someone else take care of her for a change. The older man with the cane had tears in his eyes. He wasn't crying exactly, but there was something in his expression that spoke of memories being stirred, of times and people that lived now only in his heart. The music seemed to be bringing those memories back to life, making them real again. David played on, surprised by how natural it felt. It had been so long since he'd done anything just for the joy of it, without thinking about profit or productivity, or what came next. This was pure in a way that nothing in his business life had ever been. The little girl had convinced her mother to sit down on a nearby bench. They sat together, the child leaning against her mother's side, both of them completely absorbed in the music. David could see the mother's face soften as she watched her daughter's wonder, and he realized he was witnessing something precious, a moment of pure connection between parent and child, created by something as simple as a melody. More people were stopping now. The crowd had grown to maybe 15 or 20 people, all drawn by something they couldn't quite name. In a place where everyone was usually in a hurry to get somewhere else, they had found a reason to stay still and just listen. David felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of making music not for money or recognition, but simply because it felt good to do it. His fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt truly alive. Something magical happened as David's fingers found their way to a piece he'd forgotten he even knew. It was like muscle memory from deep in his bones suddenly woke up after sleeping for 20 years. The melody that came out wasn't just notes anymore. It was pure emotion flowing through his fingertips. The crowd around him had grown without anyone really noticing. What started as 5 or 6 curious people had become 30, then 40. But David was completely lost in the music now. He couldn't see the faces watching him, couldn't hear the whispered conversations or the sound of footsteps slowing down as more people discovered what was happening in this corner of the busy station. The piece he was playing was called Moonlight on Water. Though he'd learned it so long ago, he'd almost forgotten the name. His piano teacher had given it to him when he was 16, saying it was too advanced for someone his age. But David had been stubborn back then, practicing it over and over until his fingers bled, determined to prove he could handle anything. Now, decades later, those same fingers remembered every single note. The nurse who'd been the first to stop was crying now, though she didn't seem to realize it. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she stood perfectly still, listening. The music reminded her of her grandmother's house, where an old upright piano sat in the corner of the living room. Her grandmother used to play this exact same piece on Sunday afternoons, filling the small house with beauty that made even the hardest weeks feel bearable. She'd lost her grandmother 5 years ago, and with her went the music. No one else in the family played piano. The old instrument had been sold, and those Sunday afternoon concerts became just a memory. But standing here now, listening to this stranger play, she could almost smell her grandmother's apple pie baking in the oven and feel the warmth of that sunny living room again. The older man with the cane was thinking about his wife. They'd been married for 47 years before she passed, and this was the song that had been playing in the restaurant where they had their first real date. Not the quick coffee they'd grabbed after meeting at work, but their first real official date where he'd been so nervous he could barely eat his dinner. His wife had hummed this melody while she cooked, while she folded laundry, while she worked, in their small garden. It had been the soundtrack to their life together. After she died, he couldn't listen to music anymore. It hurt too much. But hearing it now, played by this stranger's hands, didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like she was there with him again, just for a moment. The little girl with the pigtails was swaying back and forth, completely mesmerized. She didn't understand why the music made her feel like she wanted to dance and cry at the same time. Her mother had her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and for the first time in months she wasn't thinking about bills or work, or all the things she needed to get done. She was just here, sharing this perfect moment with her child. The delivery worker had completely forgotten about his schedule. He was supposed to be making his rounds, dropping off packages, staying on time. But something about the music made him remember why he'd wanted to learn guitar when he was younger. He'd never been able to afford lessons, and life had gotten in the way of dreams. But listening to this man play, he thought maybe it wasn't too late to try again. The two college students had set down their heavy backpacks and were sitting on the floor, leaning against each other. They'd been stressed about final exams, worried about grades and graduation and what came next. But the music made all of that seem less important somehow. It reminded them that there were still beautiful things in the world, still reasons to slow down and pay attention. More people kept joining the crowd. A businessman who'd been rushing to catch his train found himself frozen in place, briefcase in hand, staring at this ordinary-looking man creating something extraordinary. A janitor who'd been cleaning nearby had stopped working and was leaning on his mop, listening with his eyes closed. David transitioned into another piece without stopping, his fingers flowing from one melody into the next, like he was telling a story in music. This new song was something he'd written himself, back in college, back when he thought he might become a composer instead of a businessman. He'd never played it for anyone except his father. The crowd could feel something different about this piece. It was more personal, more raw. The notes seemed to carry pain and hope all mixed together. David was playing his own story now, the dreams he'd given up, the success that never felt quite right, the loneliness of having everything but feeling empty inside. A teenager who'd been walking by with her headphones on actually stopped and pulled them off her ears. She stood at the back of the crowd trying to look like she didn't care, but David's music was reaching her too. She was going through a tough time at home, feeling like nobody understood her, but this music made her feel less alone. It was like the pianist was speaking directly to her heart. The security guard who'd paused during his patrol had called his supervisor on his radio. "Hey, you need to come see this," he whispered. "There's something special happening at the piano." People were starting to arrive from other parts of the station now. Word was spreading the way good news always does. Quietly, from person to person. "There's a man playing piano by the information desk," someone would whisper to their friend. "You have to hear this." But David knew none of this. He was completely lost in the music, in memories of his father sitting in their old living room, listening with his eyes closed and the biggest smile on his face. His father had worked 2 jobs to pay for piano lessons, had never complained about the noise of David practicing for hours every day, had always believed his son was meant for something beautiful. "Play from your heart," his father used to say. "Don't worry about being perfect, just be honest." David was being honest now, maybe for the first time in 20 years. Every note was true. Every melody was real. He wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't trying to impress or succeed or achieve anything. He was just playing because it felt good to play, because the music needed to come out, because in this moment he remembered who he used to be before life got complicated. The crowd had grown to over 50 people now, all standing in respectful silence, all connected by something they couldn't name but could definitely feel. In a place where everyone was usually focused on getting somewhere else, they had found a reason to stay exactly where they were, and David played on, unaware that he was creating something that would change all of their lives, including his own. David's hands moved to a melody that came from the deepest part of his heart. This wasn't something he'd learned from a book or practiced for hours in music class. This was a song he'd written 23 years ago, sitting at the old piano, in his childhood apartment thinking about his father. He'd never played it for anyone, not even his dad. The melody started soft and gentle, like a whispered secret. It spoke of all the things David had wanted to say to his father, but never found the courage to. "Thank you for working 2 jobs so I could have piano lessons. Thank you for never complaining when I practiced the same piece over and over. Thank you for believing in me even when I stopped believing in myself." As his fingers found the familiar patterns, tears began rolling down David's cheeks. He didn't try to stop them or hide them. For the first time in 3 months, he was finally letting himself feel everything he'd been pushing down since the funeral. The crowd around him had grown to something incredible. Over 100 people now stood in a wide circle, some sitting on benches, others leaning against pillars, all completely silent except for the sound of David's music echoing through the vast terminal. But something even more amazing was happening, beyond just listening. The tired nurse pulled out her phone, not to record the music, but to call someone. With tears streaming down her face, she dialed a number she hadn't called in months. "Grandma?" she whispered when an elderly voice answered. "It's me. I know it's been too long since I called. I'm sorry. I was just thinking about you. About those Sunday afternoons when you used to play piano. I miss that, I miss you." A businessman in an expensive suit was doing something he hadn't done in 5 years. He was calling his son. They'd had a terrible fight about money and priorities, and neither one had been willing to be the first to apologize. But standing here listening to this music that seemed to cut straight through all the pride and stubbornness, he knew he couldn't wait anymore. "Hey, buddy," he said quietly when his son answered, moving away from the crowd so he wouldn't disturb anyone. "I know you're probably surprised to hear from me. I was wrong about a lot of things. Can we talk?" Near the edge of the circle, a teenage girl was texting her mom. They'd been fighting constantly lately, the way teenagers and parents do when they both care too much but don't know how to show it. But the music was reminding her of something important, that life was short and precious, and the people who love you are what really matter. "Mom, I'm sorry about this morning," she typed. "You were right about most of it. Love you." An older woman who'd been standing alone started talking to the person next to her, a complete stranger. "This reminds me of my husband," she said softly. He would have loved this. He always said music was the language of the heart. The stranger, a young man with kind eyes, smiled at her. "Tell me about him," he said simply. And she did, sharing memories with someone she'd never met before, finding comfort in the connection that the music had created. David's song grew stronger, more complex. The melody twisted and turned, speaking of dreams abandoned and roads not taken but also of hope that maybe it wasn't too late to find your way back to who you were meant to be. His technique was perfect now, his fingers dancing across the keys like they'd never forgotten how to do this dance. The little girl with the pigtails had convinced her mother to sit on the floor with her, cross-legged like they were at a concert in the park. The child was completely mesmerized, moving her small hands like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. Her mother watched her daughter's face, seeing pure joy and wonder there, and realized this was a moment she'd remember forever. "Mommy, how does he make the piano sound so happy and sad at the same time?" the little girl whispered. Her mother thought about it for a moment. "I think that's what real life sounds like, sweetheart. Happy and sad all mixed together." The security guards had stopped trying to keep people moving. Instead, they were helping to manage the crowd, making sure everyone could see and hear, making sure no one felt left out. One of them, a man who'd been working at the station for 15 years, had never seen anything like this. "In all my time here," he whispered to his partner, "I've never seen people stop like this. Usually everyone's in such a hurry, but look at them. They're actually connecting with each other." And it was true. All around the circle, strangers were talking to strangers. People were sharing tissues with others who were crying. Someone had started passing around bottles of water. A businessman was helping an elderly man find a place to sit down so he could hear better. David's music was building to something powerful now. The melody soared higher, became more intense, more passionate. This was the part of the song where he'd written in all his love for his father, all his gratitude, all his regret for not saying these things while he still had the chance. The notes filled every corner of the terminal. People on distant platforms stopped what they were doing and turned toward the sound. Vendors paused in their work. Even the pigeons that sometimes flew through the open spaces seemed to settle down and listen. A woman who worked at one of the coffee shops had abandoned her post entirely and was standing with tears in her eyes, thinking about her own father who lived 3 states away. She pulled out her phone and started dialing his number. "Dad? Hi, it's me. I know I don't call enough. I was just thinking about you and wanted to hear your voice." The delivery worker who'd stopped earlier was now sitting on his packages, not caring about his schedule anymore. He was thinking about all the dreams he'd put aside, all the practical choices he'd made instead of following his heart. The music was making him wonder if it was too late to change course, to try something that might make him feel as alive as this pianist looked right now. David played the final soaring section of his composition, pouring 23 years of unspoken love into every note. His father's favorite phrase echoed in his mind. "Music is the shortest distance between 2 hearts." Looking around at all these strangers who were no longer strangers, David finally understood what his father had meant. The music wasn't just notes and melodies, it was connection. It was the thing that reminded people they weren't alone in the world. As he played the last powerful chords, David realized something had changed forever. Not just in him, but in every single person standing in that circle. They'd all been touched by something bigger than themselves, something that would stay with them long after the music ended. The last note hung in the air like magic that nobody wanted to break. David's hand stayed on the keys for a moment, feeling the vibration fade slowly into silence. The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. Even the usual sounds of the station, the announcements, the footsteps, the distant rumble of trains, seemed to pause out of respect for what had just happened. Then, slowly, like sunrise breaking over a quiet lake, the applause began. It started with the elderly man who'd been thinking of his wife. His hands came together in slow, careful claps, tears still wet on his cheeks. The tired nurse joined him, then the mother with her little daughter, then the businessman who'd just called his son. Soon the entire crowd was applauding, but it wasn't the quick, polite clapping you hear at formal concerts. This was different. This was the sound of hearts saying thank you. David looked up for the first time since he'd started playing, and what he saw took his breath away. Over 100 faces looked back at him, and every single one was changed somehow. Some people were crying openly. Others were smiling through their tears. A few were still on their phones, having quiet conversations with people they loved. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky from sitting still for so long. The applause continued, but people weren't just clapping anymore. They were moving toward him, wanting to share what they'd experienced. The nurse was first. She walked up to David with tears streaming down her face and said simply, "Thank you. I just called my grandmother. We hadn't talked in 6 months because of some silly family argument. Your music reminded me that life's too short for staying angry." David felt his throat tighten. "I'm so glad," he managed to say. "Music has a way of showing us what really matters." Next came the businessman in the expensive suit. He looked completely different from the rushing, stressed person he'd been an hour ago. "I just talked to my son for the first time in 5 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We both said things we should have said a long time ago. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," David replied. "The love was already there, the music just helped you remember it." The little girl with the pigtails broke away from her mother and ran up to David. She had something clutched in her small fist, a piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded many times. "This is for you," she said shyly, holding out what turned out to be a drawing. It was done in crayon, showing a stick figure sitting at a piano with musical notes floating all around him like butterflies. At the bottom, in careful kindergarten handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for the magic." David knelt down to her level, completely overwhelmed. "Did you draw this for me?" She nodded seriously. "The music made my heart feel warm. Like when Mommy hugs me when I'm sad." Her mother came over, putting a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "She drew that while you were playing," she explained. "She said she had to make something beautiful because you were making something beautiful." David looked at the drawing again, and something inside his chest cracked open. This child, this perfect little person, had captured exactly what he'd been trying to do his whole life. Create something that made people feel less alone, less scared, more connected to the good things in the world. More people kept coming. The delivery worker told him he'd decided to sign up for guitar lessons. The teenage girl said she was going to ask her music teacher about piano. The elderly woman who'd talked about her husband gave him a hug and whispered, "He would have loved your playing." Each person had a story. Each person had been touched in a different way. Some had made phone calls to family members. Others had simply remembered something beautiful they'd forgotten. A few had decided to make changes in their lives, to pursue dreams they'd given up on. But David barely heard the individual words. He was overwhelmed by the bigger picture, by the realization that music, his music, had created all of this connection. For years, he'd measured success by bank accounts and business deals and magazine covers. But standing here, surrounded by strangers who no longer felt like strangers, he understood what real success looked like. As the crowd gradually began to thin out, people catching trains, getting back to their lives, David sat back down at the piano bench. But he didn't play. He just sat there thinking about everything that had changed in the past few hours. A security guard approached him, an older man with kind eyes. "That was something special," he said. "I've been working here for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. You brought people together in a way I didn't think was possible anymore." "Music does that," David said simply. "I'd forgotten, but music has always done that." "What you did today," the guard continued, "it mattered. I watched people reconnect with family, make new friends, remember why life is beautiful. That's not something you see every day." As David finally got up to leave, he made a decision that surprised even him. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel all my meetings for next week," he said. "Actually, cancel everything for the next month. I need to think about some changes." "Sir, the investors' meeting on Thursday is crucial for the quarterly." "The meeting can wait," David interrupted gently. "Some things are more important than quarterly reports." He hung up and looked around the terminal one more time. A few people were still there, talking quietly in small groups. The piano sat empty again, waiting for the next person brave enough to share their heart with the world. David walked away, but he wasn't the same person who had sat down at that bench a few hours ago. He had a plan now, a purpose that felt more important than any business deal he'd ever made. Within a month, David had established something he called music for everyone. It was a foundation that put pianos in public spaces all over the world, in parks, schools, hospitals, anywhere people gathered. But more than that, it funded music education for kids who couldn't afford lessons, just like he'd been all those years ago. He stepped back from running his company day to day, letting other people handle the meetings and deals while he focused on what really mattered. Every week he found a new public piano somewhere in the city. Sometimes people recognized him from that viral video someone had secretly recorded at Grand Central. But most of the time, he was just another person sharing music with the world. And every time he played, David remembered what his father had taught him. Music is the shortest distance between two hearts. He'd spent years building walls between himself and other people, measuring everything by profit and success. But sitting at that piano bench sharing his music with strangers, he'd finally learned how to build bridges instead. The little girl's drawing still hung on his wall at home, a reminder that the most important things in life can't be measured in dollars or deals, but in moments of connection, in the magic that happens when one person's heart speaks to another's through the universal language of music.